In the decade after World War I, over 1 million people contracted a mysterious neurological disease called encephalitis lethargica. Sometimes patients would experience headache, fever, vertigo, or trouble sleeping, but then make a full recovery. Others became comatose and died. And still others afflicted with the disease slipped into a sleepy, almost comatose state that they never recovered from. They presented with paralysis of the eye muscles, double vision, and sometimes lost control of their facial muscles, rendering them expressionless. But no two cases were the same, and doctors never figured out what caused the disease or any good treatment options. The epidemic hit its peak in the 1920s and left up to 500,000 people dead. But a number of patients survived in the sleepy state for decades. Then 30 years later, in the 1950s, researchers made a breakthrough into the body's production of the chemical dopamine, sometimes known as the happiness chemical. Dopamine treatment was thought to be a miracle cure for Parkinson's disease, and an unconventional and empathetic neurologist named Oliver Sacks wondered if it could also help the forgotten encephalitis lethargica patients, bringing them back into the world after decades in their sleepy state. You may have heard of Oliver Sacks before, but let me tell you, this dude was cool. He rode motorcycles with the Hells Angels and was a competitive weightlifter who at one point squatted 600 pounds. But more than anything, he was a misfit in the medical community, and it was his approach as a clinician that set him apart. See, by the 1950s, science had matured to a place that was very modern, analytic, and distant. In contrast, Oliver was extremely empathetic and tried to see the world through his patient's eyes. Instead of treating the disease, the approach popular in medicine at the time, Oliver treated the person. In the words of one observer, his primary diagnostic question was, "How are you?" In 1966, he moved to New York and started working at Beth Abraham, a chronic disease hospital. That's where he met a group of 80 patients who had been institutionalized with encephalitis lethargica, and they showed little awareness of their surroundings. Their ability to move was severely compromised. They were unable to walk or even speak. Some had been admitted in the 1920s at the peak of the epidemic and had been in their sleepy states for up to 40 years. Now, around that time, researchers were using dopamine in experimental treatments for Parkinson's disease, which presented with many of the same symptoms. So Sacks wondered if their strategies might help with his patients, even though his patients were more severely affected. While we associate dopamine these days as a happiness chemical, it has a ton of jobs inside our bodies. In the 1950s, a scientist figured out that dopamine is what's called a neurotransmitter, a chemical that lets nerve cells communicate with each other. That same scientist then experimented with a chemical called DOPA, a chemical precursor to dopamine, and found it alleviated Parkinson's symptoms in animals. A different researcher took a look at the brains of deceased Parkinson's patients and found that they were deficient in dopamine. Making the connection, this researcher proposed giving living Parkinson's patients DOPA as a way to relieve symptoms. From there, scientists found that giving intravenous DOPA improved symptoms of Parkinson's, and a form of the drug called L-DOPA proved especially effective. It was later found that L-DOPA, in the presence of certain enzymes, could cross the blood-brain barrier while DOPA could not, making L-DOPA the best medication to treat Parkinson's at the time. By the late 1960s, there was a lot of excitement about L-DOPA in the neurological community. Some of Dr. Sacks' patients actually requested the drug after hearing about it. But Sacks hesitated to use the drug on his patients for 2 full years. Part of that was its prohibitively high cost. The other was the unknown. He was concerned about how his patients would react to the new treatment. Yes, L-DOPA had a good track record in Parkinson's patients, but encephalitis lethargica was a different disease that still wasn't well understood. But following the death of some of his patients in the summer of 1968, Oliver felt compelled to experiment with L-DOPA. So in March of 1969, he began an experiment on a small group of patients. He studied 6 patients total. 3 were put on L-DOPA, 3 were given a placebo for a 90-day-long observational study. At first, the treatment was a success. The L-DOPA patients were awakened from their decades-long sleep. Very quickly after receiving the medication, some were able to speak and even walk for the first time in decades. After seeing success in the trial, Sacks started treating his other encephalitis lethargica patients with L-DOPA. They improved dramatically at first, but quickly developed tolerance to the medication and needed increased dosage to keep their symptoms at bay. To this day, we still don't know why. One idea is that some patients who had the disease had symptoms that were exacerbated by some of the metabolic byproducts of dopamine. So as patients took L-DOPA, their bodies metabolized it, which created this byproduct that caused other symptoms. Nobody has researched this hypothesis specifically on encephalitis lethargica patients, but research from other brain disorders points in that direction. Regardless, Oliver had a drug that he knew would help people, so he was compelled to share his results. But his study was more observational than traditionally quantitative, so his work was rejected by professional journals. Unable to publish in the medical literature, he described his findings in a book, Awakenings, which was released in 1973. And not only did he document how dopamine was involved in encephalitis lethargica, he gave detailed case histories for each patient. In Awakenings, each patient is described by name, not relegated to a number, and therein lies his legacy. Sachs wasn't the only person experimenting with L-DOPA at the time, but his observations were meticulous and described his patients' Parkinson's-like symptoms better than anyone else. He aimed a spotlight on the value of minute observation and description. His lasting impact on medicine is his empathetic and personal approach to treatment and his insistence on the individuality of every patient. His work finally caught a more popular audience when Awakenings was adapted into a Hollywood movie starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams in 1990. Having read Awakenings, I was struck at how Oliver wrote his patients' case histories in such a vivid and empathetic way. As a reader, I couldn't help but put myself in the patient's shoes. Oliver Sacks turned observations into humanized stories, giving a face and voice to patients with chronic mental and neurological conditions. This approach of treating the person, not the disease, would ultimately make him a key figure in modern neurology, and his work has now inspired generations of younger doctors. If you're interested in the story of Dr. Oliver Sacks and the rest of his work, check out Oliver Sacks' His Own Life, now streaming on PBS and available on major platforms. And as always, we appreciate when you like the video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.